Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again for another live edition of Everything Compliance. Today, we are going to start with Matt Kelly, and then we're going to go to Karen Moore, and Jonathan Armstrong is going to give us some thoughts on estate planning for those who may have too many yachts. I'm going to talk about Dexit, which is corporations leaving Delaware. So, with that, Matt, there's a lot actually going on this week. What got your attention?
Tom, I wanted to talk about export control compliance because we had a fascinating and complicated and messy case served up to us from the State Department, which imposed a $200 million fine on RTX Corporation, which is the terribly blandly named large defense contractor that is an amalgamation of Raytheon and United Technologies in 2020 and the amalgamation, I guess, of United Technologies and Rockwell Collins back in 2018. This is all important because what happened here is that RTX and its predecessor companies, all three of them, really fluffed up what are known as the ITAR regulations. Those are the regulations from the State Department that govern the export of military sensitive technologies, not to be confused with economic sanctions, which are managed by the Commerce Department under the Export Administration, it's the sanctions. But basically, what happened here is that Raytheon, United Technologies, Rockwell Collins dealt with a lot of very sensitive military technologies, also very large companies that had global assembly lines, and they were called out for, in the 2010s, shipping important, sensitive, classified technical data to overseas suppliers, including those in China, who should not have seen that data. And that was a violation of the ITAR regulations administered by the State Department. Many years later, here we are with this $200 million settlement. Also, in addition to those ITAR violations, the companies were called out for poor oversight of their employees taking company-owned devices on personal trips to unwelcoming foreign adversary jurisdictions, including Russia, where basically the employees were going on personal trips to these countries. They were taking their work laptops filled with classified data and firing them up and then logging onto a network at local wherever in Moscow or in Lebanon or in other countries. And who knows who was spying on those networks? And they then obtained classified information. So this is a big mess. And we have some pretty important compliance lessons to learn here. I'll try and walk through two. How did this compliance mess happen in the first place? And then what are the compliance reforms that RTX has now agreed to make? Starting with the next, as I said, this traces back at least to 2014 when Rockwell Collins, for example, was shipping technical data to suppliers in China who were then building these wiring systems for fighter jets, missile guidance systems, and whatnot. And Chinese suppliers would therefore have access to this confidential and classified data. They'd build the assemblies, ship them back to Rockwell Collins here in the United States, which then put these parts into larger defense systems they were selling to the US government. And then it would be many months or longer before Rockwell realized, yikes, we shouldn't have had the Chinese suppliers build these sensitive items. Let's tell the Defense Department. They should have been telling the Defense Department right away. And this was a period sometimes of years before Rockwell told the Pentagon, by the way, we were giving you components assembled by Chinese suppliers. Who knows how effective they are? Who knows what they learned from studying our technical data? And the interesting point here is that why did Rockwell Collins have this failure as outlined in the State Department settlement order? Because Rockwell fundamentally misunderstood what it was supposed to be complying with. I mentioned the ITAR regulations for military goods administered by the State Department. Rockwell thought it was subject to the EAR regulations on commercial goods that should not be exported, and that is enforced by the Commerce Department. And from that misunderstanding flowed all of these compliance violations. And Rockwell was not the only one. These sort of violations also happened at United Technologies separately. Then United Technologies acquired Rockwell Collins in 2018. Makes you wonder, what was the pre-acquisition due diligence that it did not detect this? And then United Technologies, consequently, they were also making these mistakes. They were acquired by Raytheon or merged or however you want to describe it. But the inheritor company, RTX, which really was Raytheon ultimately, like, they didn't catch this in their due diligence of UTC either. So we have important pre-acquisition due diligence lessons that we need to learn here. There were flaws in the cybersecurity oversight. So let me pivot back now to the employees who were flitting around the world. And this was in the early 2020s. So by then, this was not a problem inherited from Rockwell or from United Technologies or from Raytheon, all three of whom had been guilty of that sin I mentioned before about sending ITAR related information to overseas countries they should not have sent it to. This was RTX, the final company. They were still failing when, for example, in 2021, I think it was, an employee went to Russia and he took his company laptop with classified data on it and then logged onto a network at the, I don't know, the local whatever, the coffee shop or something. And then the cybersecurity software on that laptop did correctly warn the RTX cybersecurity people back in the United States. We have this employee who just pinged up in St. Petersburg and he has classified data. We should intercept this activity. And the cybersecurity people said, we've been getting a lot of false positives because we have a new cybersecurity alerting system that we're still working out the kinks of. That's probably nothing. Let's just dismiss it. And that was unaddressed for a week or two when they had military classified data in St. Petersburg, one of our clear and most pronounced adversaries in the world. Another one, for example, this is failures of process. A employee took in his laptop with sensitive data on a personal trip to Lebanon, which is also a high risk jurisdiction for classified military data. So he did well, before he left, he did not tell anybody, and he had a disclosure form he had to fill out where I was going. He didn't put down that he was going to Lebanon. He amended the form after the fact that he had gone to Lebanon, but he spelled Lebanon with the French spelling of it, which is, I believe, pronounced Liban, and it's not spelled Lebanon. And that was a discrepancy. And so nobody at the cybersecurity team caught up to it. And so they had yet another breach. And so we have these misunderstandings of what are the regulations we're supposed to comply with. We have the poor pre-acquisition due diligence that nobody caught this. Nobody caught these mistakes even when they were making the mistakes themselves. And should they perhaps have thought, maybe this target we're acquiring, maybe they're doing the same thing that we are. And then they had these mistakes about where are our employees going with what sensitive data, and are they taking the data to places they should not be, and can we intercept and control their hardware, which is company owned, or the data, which is classified. And they didn't put two and two together to realize that they had moments they should have intercepted. So that's the big, huge compliance mess that happened with RTX. Now, let me talk a little bit about the reforms. What is really interesting is that above all, RTX needs to appoint what is known as a special compliance officer. That is the actual title. This person seems more to me like a compliance monitor or one of those independent compliance consultants that we see a lot with the messaging cases that the SEC is enforcing against financial firms. Their employee messaging apps are all over the place. And so the firms have to hire a special compliance consultant who really is kind of like a monitor. This special compliance officer is also a lot like that. They cannot be somebody who has worked for Raytheon or United Technologies or any other previous version of RTX for 5 years. They have to be an outsider. They basically cannot be fired for at least 2 years while the special compliance officer does this hurry up offense kind of program of trying to revamp RTX's compliance policies and procedures, its training, All of this has to be done within the first 9 to 12 months, which would put it by next June, I think. RTX has to have this special compliance officer really revamp the whole export controls program. And when you are a defense contractor, that's going to be really hard to do. This person will have their own staff. They will be able to report directly to the agency within the State Department that oversees this. That is the Defense Trade Controls Compliance Office, I think it is, the DTCC. So it's really interesting to see that RTX has essentially been told you need to get an independent compliance monitor in all but name, but really, that's what this person will be able to do. They're going to have to perform at least one audit within the first year, I think it is. They are on a 3-year consent decree. The $200 million fine, 100 million of which must be paid. But this is also interesting. The second 100 million will be forgiven if RTX is spending that 100 million on compliance program improvements for over the next 3 years. And to top it all off, they also must literally show the receipts, because they're going to have to file annual financial reports to the DTCC showing, "Here's how we spent that $100 million." And I don't know if they're gonna spend it in one third, or how it's gonna work, but they must make annual cost reports and accounting reports to the regulators to show how much they are spending on compliance and where this is going. It's a really big, invasive thing. And I got to admit, it's astounding because Raytheon and United Technologies, they were not small companies. They were not immature and lacking robust compliance programs. And I know some of the compliance and internal audit people there who have generally, I thought, have been top notch. But it is astonishing that they had made some fundamental mistakes for years. And now they're going to have a whole lot of work that they're going to be doing.
Who wants to have a $33 million budget for their annual compliance program?
Eh,
Do you think
Matt?
they care?
It's an interesting point, Jonathan, because these offenses are so astonishing. You'd have to wonder, could the regulators have thought about debarring Raytheon or RTX? And I think they're somewhat in the same boat as Boeing. Is this is serious and egregious misconduct? But let's not kid ourselves. These companies are too big to fail from a regulatory perspective. We need them. They are the only ones who make some of the goods that we're talking about. So no, they're not going to be debarred. Do they care? Does the company care? Ultimately, who pays for all of this? The taxpayer, because they're defense contractors. To a certain extent, they can just tack on all of this to the cost of doing business, but it's going to be a big cost. It does, however, just kind of, I don't want to lurch off into some antitrust rant, but we can't debar RTX. We can't debar Raytheon. They're doing some really astonishingly bad things with regulatory compliance and a culture of compliance and awareness. And yet they're never going to pay the ultimate price, which would be the US government saying, bye bye, we're not going to do business with you. That's never going to happen.
And I somewhere read that Raytheon had reserved 1.2 billion for a total settlement, global settlement of all of these issues. Any thoughts on whether the DOJ might prosecute?
That is a good question because as much as I've just gone on now for what, 10 minutes or so here about RTX, this is not the only regulatory thing that they have. They apparently are planning for some sort of extensive FCPA settlement, which is like the worst secret in the defense industry at this point. They have set aside 1.2 billion, so this is 2.2, so there's a billion more in regulatory settlements to come. I don't know what the FCPA settlements that are apparently afoot. I don't know what they are about. I don't know what that's going to look like. I fully expect that this is going to get announced probably in the month of September because DOJ wants to wrap this up ideally before the end of the fiscal year for the government, and certainly before the election and any change of power that may or may not happen in January. So I don't know. Like this is one shoe out of multiple shoes that have to drop. But the other billion or so in regulatory settlements, that's not even what I'm talking about. I'm only sticking with export control issues here. But RTX they got more issues to come.
All right, Mr. Marks, you're batting fourth today. Karen Moore, we had a declination last week that turned out to be quite interesting. What interested you about it?
Several things. First, thanks to the DOJ for publishing Declination. That wasn't really so much of a practice in the past, and it's always really instructive, although it's all of 2 pages. So we're a little bit light on some of the facts. I have a few of the questions there. My other first thought when I started reading through it was like, ugh, another third party agent problem within a company that should certainly know better. There there are a few negatives here and a bunch of positives and a few open questions. On the negative side, this all has to do with bribery of government officials in Angola in order to win government contracts through third party agents who were engaged via contracts which awarded them a 30 odd percent, it's anywhere from 25 to 35% fee for success, which, is already one of the number one red flags for agency agreements, right? Is first of all, is the commission in line with commissions paid for this kind of work? This seems extraordinarily high. And B, should we be working with agents on a commission basis at all? Because it incentivizes all sorts of bad behaviors. According to the declination letter, these payments were going on for a 6-year period, 2011 to 2017. So it is a little astounding that no controls caught any of this, that there was no extraordinary oversight in place for these types of arrangements in this type of a market. This was all handled out of one office in Portugal, and payments were made through a variety of contracts which involved offshore accounts of the agents. So another red flag there that I would question why that didn't get caught. On the sort of silver lining side for Boston Consulting Group, the people involved in Portugal actually manipulated the documents. They created contracts, they backdated them, they put in kind of false information. If you get aside from the respondeat superior liability of Boston Consulting Group for its Portuguese operations, in some ways helps them show that at least these people involved understood that what they were doing was wrong, that there was a very high likelihood that payments were going to the wrong people via the third party agents. So in some ways, it kind of protects what the company might have had in place in terms of educating people on bribery and corruption issues. It also seems from the scope of this that we're talking about one off. That means it really involved Portuguese office and their operations, and it involved payments into Angola. Presumably, they did a much broader investigation to rout out whether this was happening elsewhere in the organization and didn't find anything. So, this is kind of a bad apple situation, you might say, which is one of the drums that I like to bang, which is the importance of rooting out microcultures in an organization, finding out, are there places where the message that we think we're sending is somehow being diverted or corrupted and the operations being held hostage to some sort of a microclimate being created in that market. So we've got this kind of bad situation. Boston Consulting Group found out about this, self-disclosed to the DOJ, got a lot of kudos in this very short 2-page letter for the timeliness of their disclosure, although there's no timeline dates there. So it'd be really helpful if the DOJ started to give us some hints so that we could compile data and start to see what does timely mean. Most importantly, the Boston Consulting Group also engaged in the type of clawback activity even before the DOJ started hitting on the clawback as an important component of response to discovered misconduct. They took out all the equity of the Portuguese partners. They didn't pay them their bonuses. They didn't pay them these kind of transition fees. They fired them all. And I think they got a lot of credit for that, especially given that the basic incentive for the clawback under current DOJ policy is that you get to deduct that from the fines that you're paying, but there are no fines here, just a disgorgement of the 14 odd million in profit that was associated with these contracts. Kudos to Boston Consulting Group for really taking a tough decision, I think, and pretty much decimating their Portuguese operations and maybe starting fresh there. Do you have a bunch of questions here with this? One is, I think that they closed their offices in Portugal. So what's next with the angle? Who's managing Angola and where is it being managed from and how are they managing it? It's really unclear to me whether Boston Consulting Group has taken the biggest learning they could from this, which is to reevaluate their third-party agency agreement, either by putting in way more controls, not even over controlling, but kind of the normal controls you'd want to put over these types of relationships, or following the lead of Albemarle and a couple of others by just absolutely backing away from these third-party agency arrangements and saying, this is not the way that we're effectively doing business. We've got to find a workaround. So I don't know. There's not a lot of information there. The other thing I'm really unclear about is in the declination letter, it says that Boston Consulting Group discovered this misconduct in 2014, but the time period for the misconduct is 2011 to 2017. So I'm really not clear how that 2014 discovery dovetails with a timely disclosure. I don't know when the disclosure was made to the DOJ, the extent and length of their own internal investigation. But the fact that it seems that the misconduct continued on past their date of discovery, I have a lot of questions about that. So that would be interesting to know. And then the last couple of comments I wanted to make is that we're seeing kind of boilerplate language in these declinations. We've seen it also in, for example, the Boeing settlement. Two things. One is just because we've entered into this arrangement with you doesn't mean that we're going to forego our opportunity to prosecute individuals. So curious whether that might still ensue or whether this is just going to be kind of the standard language with no teeth to it. It also reserves the right to bring charges if the DOJ determines that there's additional information that changes their assessment. So the declination clearly doesn't completely shut the door, but I think there are a lot of interesting points here, bunch of questions I would love to have answered. But like I said, kudos now to the DOJ for helping us out with the underpinning of these declination decisions.
Matt, do you have a question or comment for Karen?
I have a more of a comment, actually, two, now that I think about it. I did write about this declination myself, and I took a close read at the letter. And specifically, they only say about when this was discovered that Boston Consulting discovered this in an email from 2014. But like you, Karen, I don't know what that means. Did they find it in 2014? Were they doing an audit in 2019 and then did a look back and found there was an email from 2014 that they pulled on the thread and suddenly they realized what was going on? I do wish we had a bit more clarity into what a timely self-disclosure is. Are we talking a couple of weeks? Are we talking a couple of months? We don't know. But I mean, my big comment looking at that was I was really struck by Boston Consulting forcing the partners in question to give up their equity in the firm. If you want to give an offending employee a gut shot punch, that's how you do it. I am sure they didn't like the loss of their job or the loss of the bonus or the severance payment, but the equity is something that they have worked up at this firm for however many years they've been working there at a large consulting firm like Boston Consulting. That is probably worth millions for some partners. I don't know if it was worth millions for these Portugal partners, but your equity stake in a consulting firm, that's potentially your retirement savings, and now it's gone. So the way I had thought about it was more like, not only did they impose punishment on these offending employees' future activities, because people are going to wonder, why did you get fired and you didn't get a bonus and all that? By taking away the equity, the company really wiped out everything that these employees had ever done, because that's how you build up equity in your firm is you work there for a long time. You get a bit and a bit, and the success of the firm guides the value of the equity, and all of that is gone because of this misconduct. So if you're looking for ways to really scare the bejesus out of executives, that's a good way to do it. And that's all I'll say.
All right, Mr. Armstrong, what is on your mind?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about Mike Lynch. First of all, I think it's important that we mourn his loss. He obviously died on the 19th of August alongside some friends and some colleagues in the sinking of the Bayesian. a large yacht, on which more later. And it's important to say, I think, that there's currently an investigation in Italy over the sinking of that yacht. Well, one of the things that's been going through my mind really is a chap's not timed announcement shortly after the death saying the litigation goes on and we still want our money. And I think that's interesting both from a legal and from a reputation point of view. And I thought it might be interesting to unpick some of those. And obviously, Matt maybe has some thoughts on reputational issues as well. So where does all this come from? Mike Lynch, and I think I might have told the story on this podcast before. I didn't know him. I was invited to dinner with him once. I have my own opinion, which I guess will remain my own opinion on Mike Lynch. But I will say that I didn't invest in autonomy after meeting with him. But HP did to a large extent. They spent £8.6 billion, and apologies will range between pounds and dollars. So you might need a pen and paper if you want to keep up. But autonomy was sold to HP for £8.6 billion in 2011, of which apparently Lynch got around $800 million. And I say Lynch, but we know that, let's say, Lynch connected entities got that amount of money. We don't know exactly who picked up the check. Now, soon after, HP had what Lynch's team has always called buyer's remorse. HP went through a change of management. I think they thought that the strategy that determined that they'd buy businesses like Autonomy was reversed by new management. And they soon looked at the value of their acquisition and took an $8.8 billion write down of the Autonomy assets. So effectively, they've more or less said it was worth virtually nothing compared to what they'd paid for it. And then Exit Lynch pursued Buyer Bear, or rather pursued by the SFO, who HP had involved and asked to investigate Lynch in connection or Autonomy in connection with the misstatement of their accounts. And effectively, HP said that they were duped, that there had been transactions involving hardware, value-added resellers that they couldn't have discovered on due diligence, and that effectively amounted to fraud. Now, it was somewhat of an embarrassing investigation because the SFO had trumpeted the fact that they were using new technology in investigating wrongdoing, and that new technology was provided by, anyone want to guess? Autonomy. There's somewhat of an odd situation where they launch an investigation into a business who's their own technology provider to investigate that business. Now, the SFO said that they were clear, that wasn't a conflict of interest, and it didn't hamper their investigation. But in 2015, they closed their investigation and they said that some residual matters would be passed on to the US authorities. And that wasn't an end of the criminal consequences of the sale. Obviously, the US authorities picked this up. Lynch and a co-accused, a guy called Chamberlain, were extradited to the US with some politically charged extradition proceedings, but they were acquitted on the 6th of June this year. Now, somewhat strangely, as I've said, Lynch died in a boating accident on the 19th of August, and his co-accused, Chamberlain, I believe, died the day before in a mysterious road traffic accident. But parking that for now, obviously, as far as the criminal proceedings are concerned, then Lynch and his co-accused are innocent. No criminal findings against them. However, HP also started civil proceedings, and they issued proceedings in the UK in March 2019. And there was a very long-running trial, which led to a judgment from Mr. Justice Holdroyd, over 93 days of court hearings, some 9 months in total. And effectively, the judge said in 2022 that there was a victory for HP. That wasn't a 100% victory, but that he would come back to the case and award damages HP. And that's sort of where we're at the moment. There's been a damages hearing earlier this year. The judge has signaled the fact that HP may have won, but they can't expect the amount they're claiming for. They're claiming about $5 billion US. And he also questioned the credibility of some of HP's witnesses. And he also basically said that he thought that HP probably would have bought autonomy anyway, given the way in which the then management behaved versus the new management. Where's this case likely to go? I suppose one of the things it tells us is difference between the civil and the criminal standard of proof. So it's relatively common. There's another case in the UK over the death of a millionairess, for example, for the courts or the prosecutors to think they can't make the criminal standard beyond all reasonable doubt, but they can make the criminal standard on a balance of probabilities. And that may be what's happened here. But I think it's a difficult decision for HP to proceed. Yes, on the reputational basis, but also where are the assets? How are they going to enforce the judgment? Now, we're told that this is a case which has already cost about £20 million. And I guess HP would say they've a duty to their shareholders to pursue litigation like this. But if you haven't got assets at the other end, is it in the shareholders' best interests to put more lawyers' children through private education? Because that might be the upsum of what happens here. Whenever I've got clients who are entering into litigation or looking at trying to seize assets from bad people who've done bad things at their corporation, I often ask that they look at assets first. Sometimes you need a Pyrrhic judgment. Sometimes you need a paper judgment. Sometimes you have to cut a few heads off to save you having to execute the wider population. But it's always a tough choice. And why it's a tough choice in this case is there are already warning signs that assets may not be in Mr. Lynch's estate. We know, for example, from yacht registration documents that if you call the yacht an asset, and I'm not wishing to be uncouth, but it's was a very valuable asset, but it's now lying at the bottom of the sea in a deteriorated condition. But even if HP had the guts to try and seize the yacht and sell it, then it seems that it's owned by an offshore trust, the beneficiary of which may be Mrs. Lynch, but not Mr. Lynch's estate. And it's entirely within the realms of possibility, I think, when you've seen that, a yacht that apparently he very much liked, that other assets may be in offshore trusts, maybe in other vehicles. I'd be surprised if there was much in his personal estate, particularly given the litigation and particularly given the criminal actions that he's faced. So then you're in with an even more difficult decision. Do you try and reverse transactions that have put assets into trust? Is that possible? Because it might be that those assets, that $800 million, never went into his sole name. It may have been paid into other entities at his order. So how do you reverse the transaction to get assets back when they were never in his name in the first place? And do you really want to sue his widow, who's also, don't forget, recently lost a child, for her part or her alleged part in transactions which may have moved assets to her name or trusts controlled by her? My suspicion is this all gets very messy again. Obviously, two of the lawyers that helped Mr. Lynch in his defense of the criminal litigation and the civil charges were also tragically involved in this boating incident as well. So they're not around to assist. But it seems to me that whilst ever we thought we'd seen the back of this litigation, we probably haven't. And I guess for any corporation in this position, the opportunity sometimes is to either sleepwalk into saying, we still plan to get our vengeance, or take a moment and think what the right response might be. And in these circumstances, that might be to lick their wounds and to move on.
Mr. Kelly, do you have a question or comment for Mr. Armstrong?
I suppose my only question for this case that has now lingered through at least half of my compliance career, which is the 20 years. My question here is, when they do the TV serialized account, will this be a Netflix miniseries or some sort of Law and Order special episode? And I also want to go on the record now, when they make that show, I'm putting the marker down. Rory Kinnear, the actor, he's the one who's going to play Mike Lynch. This case is just astonishing to me, and I don't know what else to say.
Well, I'm going to have to trump everyone with the 70s television series QB7, based upon the book by Leon Uris, where a libel and slander case was brought in British court. The plaintiff did succeed, and he was awarded 1 pence, the then lowest lowest coin in the realm. And I think that's what HP is probably entitled to at this point. Mr. Marks, what has been on your mind?
Since I'm batting cleanup, which I should be because the Phillies are in first place again. Sorry, Astros. That there's a lot of things that are going on in the compliance realm and from a risk management perspective. And so I thought maybe I'd talk about audit committees, roles and responsibilities. And a hook 'em horns, by the way. And we could go on and give a whole list of things that they're supposed to be responsible for. But if anybody's out there listening, for crying out loud, let's get back to basics. Internal controls still suck. And I don't understand why, from an audit committee's perspective, they just don't understand. I don't know what they're reading, what they're not reading. I don't know how involved they are with internal audit. I don't know if they're reading the internal audit reports. I don't know whether they're actually forming and shaping and challenging internal audit with regards to what their scope is and the timing of certain things that they're doing. I don't know. I don't know if they're meeting with the chief audit executive in executive session, along with the chief compliance officer. I don't know if they're looking at fraud risk assessments. I don't know if they're asking about whistleblower hotlines. There are a lot of things that I just don't know anymore. I think there's a lot of glitz and glam about being on a board. There's also a lot of glitz and glam about being on an audit committee. But I just wonder, since the skills of the folks that did process mapping with the flowchart template are gone, whether people really, and especially the audit committee, really understands what's going on within the organization these days, especially from a financial perspective and an internal control perspective. Their oversight responsibilities, certainly looking at this from a holistic perspective and what they should be looking at. It's no longer overseeing just financial. They're certainly operational and they're emerging risks. I mean, we could talk about cybersecurity and ESG till we're blue in the face. I mean, just kind of moving on from there. But having diverse expertise is wonderful, but not having the right expertise with some of the key issues that I see are pervasive over and over again is really problematic. If you look at some of the cases, it's failure to provide proper oversight, breakdown in internal controls. It's the same stuff that's happening over and over again. Yet somebody's looking for some, unicorn out there that understands all of ESG because they think that's sort of the next best thing. That's wonderful. But I think we really need to start to focus on what roles and responsibilities. Let's go back to blocking and tackling. Let's go back to what the stakeholders expect. Let's go back to the fact that audit means something. And working with the external auditors, making sure that there's lack of bias, making sure that they're doing the right things, coordinating and communicating with them. Again, all the things that I'm mentioning should be all part of what the audit committee is doing. But the one thing that I keep coming back to that just sticks in my craw over and over again is this controls thing. And I don't think the audit committee gets it. I don't think they understand it. And it's really bothersome. And I think it's only going to get worse because if you see what's going on with all of these things, even these declarations that are being sent out there, and you fundamentally break down everything from a root cause perspective, it goes back to that control environment. It goes back to root cause. It's, why did people circumvent or override those controls? Why was there no monitoring to begin with? How did they miss this? What were we doing? That's all part of this. And it drives me bananas that we're trying to get so crazy with all this when fundamentally, if you just sit down and just kind of X things out, the things that I mentioned should be, what the audit committee should be focusing in on. That's what they should be doing. And it's just not getting done.
Karen Moore, you have a question or comment for Jonathan Marks?
Yeah, I do. And mostly it's a hallelujah because I just subscribe to everything Jonathan just said. I mean, I go back to the broken record that I keep playing, which is that the competency for being on the audit committee is and should be financial acumen. So you've got people who really should understand the finance side of what they are charged with overseeing, but they don't always understand how internal controls work. And they very rarely, in my experience, seem to really understand how compliance works and what their responsibilities are there. Big question for me is, should the audit committee really be charged with these expanding roles of oversight on things that they don't comprehend? Having said that, there's always the pull side of it where the committee should be getting information, but there's also the push side of it. So I think that as compliance professionals, sometimes we take some of the blame for complying with these kind of very short, very pro forma reports to the audit committee that are really almost an afterthought. It's a little bit of, okay, we've got the report. We don't have any questions, anything we need to know. Let's move on because we're behind in the agenda. Compliance discussion very often tends to be overlooked. And I think as compliance professionals, sometimes we need to push a little bit more to say, I need more time. I need a discussion. I need some sort of a risk appetite feedback from all of you. So I'm applying my energies in the right place. And if we're not going to put that into a different committee that has better educated members to provide that kind of ability to have that good discussion, we're going to need to find our way in. It just astounded me, Matt, when you were talking about RTX, that the whole ITAR issue, which for a company like RTX should be really in their top 3 of mission critical risks, was something that got overlooked almost completely, and that the audit committee somehow didn't really, want to have a little bit more information about how a risk like that was being managed. So that just
Yeah.
adding 2 cents to you, Jonathan.
No, I appreciate that and good commentary. And I keep thinking to myself, I talk to folks all the time, and I say to the audit committee chairs or whatever, how many times have you met with the chief audit executive or the chief compliance officer? We don't really meet that much. We meet a couple. Well, really interesting. If you read the audit reports, we read some of them. We don't read all of them. Oh, interesting. Do you know what no plur is? What? No plur? What are you talking about? Is that a new candy bar? No, it's not a new candy bar. It's something that you should be fully aware of. And by the way, if that really does gravitate and take hold and grows legs, some of the things that we're talking about here today, that certainly I would think would possibly kick in certain circumstances. So how does the audit committee not be aware of that? Again, if you're on an audit committee, you're listening to this podcast today, I'm not browbeating you. I'm not saying anything, but for crying out loud, start asking questions and make sure that you're reading the stuff appropriately and you're digesting it with the right mind's eye and you have that good information, because if not, you're going to miss it. In every one of these things, I don't know whether they're missing it or it's just not being communicated, or organizations are still in silo mode where information is not being shared from one one department to another or one function to another. But I would imagine it's a little bit of all of that, but it's really problematic and it's only going to get worse.
Matt, question or comment for Mr. Marks?
Mostly just an amen to Reverend Mark's sermon here because it's spot on. But if anybody wants really a glaring example of what we're talking about, just yesterday, the Securities and Exchange Commission settled a accounting fraud case with the company where they faulted the company for poor control environment, poor segregation of duties. But this was a business, a maker of industrial valves, well north of $500 million a year in annual revenue, not a small company, where their UK finance director, who has been charged with accounting fraud, basically had complete reign over that subsidiary's finances. He was the one who compiled all the financial statements for that unit. He was the one who then uploaded all of that into the consolidated statements. And he was the one with sole control and access over that unit's bank accounts to do the reconciliations. So the senior management back in the US parent company had no visibility into what he was really doing with the company. And so now he's charged with running a fraud scheme there for 3 years. But what got to me was okay, poor segregation duties, poor control environment. And the company had been disclosing this in its controls and procedures for several years. And nobody at the audit committee thought we should light a fire under the CEO or the CFO or the internal auditor to clean this up. And then we're surprised that now suddenly it looks like there was a restatement, there was fraud, and this man is now facing civil charges with the SEC. What? Come on. And this is just basic block and tackle stuff, like you're saying, Jonathan. And I just couldn't believe some of these problems just apparently never go out of style.
Yeah. And just to kind of expand on that just a little bit, and I appreciate the commentary, it's spot on as well. But, I think about this and I say to myself, okay, fine, let's go back to the controls thing for a second. Unremediated controls.
Yep.
That's not a red flag. That's a giant red flag. If you don't have a plan to remediate controls and they're carrying themselves forward year to year, unless it's some technology thing that it just costs too much to fix, but there has to be a plan to at least address those particular things. When I start to see the same things carry themselves year after year, I start to say, guess what? Now it might be the control environment's bad. Maybe it's poor tone from the top. Maybe there are bigger issues here that we have. And I think maybe we're a little soft on issuing the material weakness categorization on certain control failures. Again, nobody wants a material weakness. It doesn't look good for sure. But I wonder, since all the pressure is being put back on the auditor again, whether that's going to really raise its ugly head going forward, especially with this no-clar stuff.
Mr. Armstrong, any comments or thoughts from across the pond on this issue?
Yeah, you invited me in the chat to say, is it different in the UK? I'm not convinced it is. And short infomercial, if I may. On Thursday, avid listeners will recall I'm involved in a business called Elevate, which trains people to be non-executive directors of private and public entities. So we're having an Elevate training session in Derby, if any dear listeners happen to be nearby. And we've done this handy guide for delegates at the event. But I think you're right that it's an audit issue, but it's not just an audit issue, isn't it? If you're flagging this as a potential problem, you should be flagging it at board meetings. And what are the board doing about it? And yes, this is a responsibility of the audit committee, but not just the audit committee. One of the things that we've done in the guide, and yes, Mr. Marks, I'll get a copy to you, is, directors are responsible for their sphere of excellence, but not just that. If you're on the audit committee and your LinkedIn profile says you're really good at audit stuff, then you're going to be judged to that higher standard. But if you're a board and you're a passenger on the bus, then you're going to be judged to a standard as well. And I know we've said this before, but organizations need more diversity on their boards. And it's not just diversity of background, it's diversity of skills as well. And we also need directors that are going to challenge each other in a collegiate environment rather than say, Marx is the numbers man. Marx is responsible for numbers. I'm not going to touch that, because you'll be breaching your responsibilities as the director, and you're likely to face consequences as a result. And by the way, that's something that D&O cover doesn't fix.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are now to our fan favorites, shout outs and rants. We will keep the same order, and we will start with Matt Kelly. You have a shout out and or rant for us today.
I do have a shout out. I actually want to shout out to the Brazilian judiciary for finally somebody in this world having the temerity to stand up to Elon Musk, where, as I'm sure most listeners probably know, they have basically taken Twitter off the air because Elon Musk will not comply with judicial orders in that country to take down certain right wing hate accounts that are peddling disinformation. I have complained about Elon Musk multiple times on this podcast before. I won't get wound up on him right now. But everybody who is saying that this is an attack on free speech, okay, A, you don't have free speech. You don't have a right to free speech to call for violence in the streets or violence against the government. B, you do not have free speech to falsely shout fire in a crowded theater. And that's what the accounts in question were doing. And C, who is Elon Musk that he thinks he can just thumb his nose at a government trying to hold him accountable for the actions his business is undertaking? And I also do want to just call out that everybody who is saying this is an assault on free speech, let's remember that this is Brazil, and not everybody in the world has the same sort of absolutist free speech views that many Americans do. And I am in favor of free speech. I've been making my life living for the last 30 or 45 years, embracing freedom of the press. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the US way is the only way. Brazil has different standards, and we talk all the time about appreciating local cultural standards. That's sometimes what this means. Although I would wipe all of that aside and just say Elon Musk is running a very reckless business over there. He is allowing these accounts to run roughshod over Brazilian attempts at governance. And so the government held him up and said, no, you are accountable for this. Frankly, I'd love to see more accountability brought to Elon Musk in other countries, such as the United States, against other giant tech companies such as Facebook. There's way too much calling for violence and absolute flat out falsehoods. And we're nuts if we think it's okay to pass that off as just okay. No, it's not. I'm glad to see that some Brazilian judges out there have finally pointed out that rather obvious fact. And just because Elon Musk doesn't like it, then it doesn't have to be there. And apparently the Brazilian judges have called his bluff, and more power to him.
Karen Moore, do you have a shout out and or rant for us?
I do. I have a shout out to the Victorian Lyric Opera Company as it opens its new season. They had the foresight, I don't know, to add me to their board. They decided that having a super fan would be a good competency addition to what they had, which are highly trained and skilled and smart theater and musical performers on their board. I've been absolutely astounded at the shoestring on which this company operates. Absolutely floored by the amount that the members of the orchestra get paid. If you think about the years and years of training it takes to be able to play in an orchestra, you'd expect them to be kind of NFL players in terms of their compensation, but they are way below school teachers who are already, I think, grossly underpaid for the work that they do. My real shout out is to the Victorian Lyric Opera Company, which operates here in the DMV area, resident theater at the F. Scott Fitzgerald in Rockville. If you are a fan, as I am, of comedic opera, I encourage you and invite you to come along. But really, hats off to them and to all the other regional theaters that just operate out of a true love of the performance and certainly not for any massive financial remuneration.
Jonathan Armstrong, do you have a shout out and or rant for us?
Yeah, mine's way less erudite. I'm going to maybe shout out, maybe rant out of Claude Wehrle, and I might be getting the pronunciation wrong. If so, I apologize. He was the technical sales lead at a French business called Arconic. And they've been a feature of the Grenfell Tower inquiry, which just published a huge report in the UK. He's the guy who said that it had to remain, quote, very confidential is capitalized, that their products really weren't fit for purpose and they weren't fire retardant as it seems he had claimed. He was invited to give evidence to the inquiry and he didn't show up. And he said that French law prevented him from turning up. The inquiry says that this was a questionable interpretation of the law. But in any event, they proceeded without him. If he intended by that he wouldn't feature in the report, he was wrong. He was mentioned more than 100 times. The inquiry found that he engaged in deliberate dishonesty. And when questioned about this, he said, I wasn't the one making decisions. So whilst it seems, he says, that he knew the product was unsafe, he knew the product shouldn't be sold, and continued to sell it, he said that it was someone else's job to decide if the company was responsible. And why does any of this matter? It matters because 72 people died when the tower block was set on fire with these panels on the outside that exacerbated the fire. So I'm afraid Mr. Wehrle, I think at least owes it to the family of those 72 individuals to show up, and hiding behind an interpretation of French law just isn't the look he should be going for.
Jonathan Marks, do you have a shout out and or rant for us? You're on mute, Jonathan.
I'm not going to be talking about fast food workers or breakthroughs in drug therapy or how poorly my meal has been delivered by DoorDash from a certain fast food company as well. But I am going to be talking about the NFL and the moronic move they made by having a freaking football game in Brazil on Friday night. And I don't know what the heck they're thinking, but football is an American thing. I get the global aspect of it, but for crying out loud, the first game of the season in Brazil, especially my team, Roger Goodell.
There you go, folks. The first full raspberry ever on Everything Compliance. I'm going to end with a shout out to Dr. Stephen Bainbridge. He is the William D. Warren Distinguished Professor of Law at the UCLA School of Law and generally recognized as one of the company's top experts on corporate law. He has about to release a exhaustive study of the Dexit, which is the concept where corporations are leaving Delaware for other states. And he looked at all of the stated reasons, including franchise savings tax, quality of state law, corporate governance flexibility, transactional flexibility, perceptions of determinacy, D&O litigation risk. And he concluded, or the data suggested two conclusions. And I'm going to read directly from his report. First, almost all reasons given for reincorporation seem implausible. If Dexit becomes more frequent, plaintiffs' lawyers should scrutinize these disclosures, particularly focusing on enhanced liability protection for controllers, directors, and officers, suggesting possible conflicts of interest requiring new fairness review. Second, the number of reincorporations from Delaware remains minimal compared to the vast number of new reincorporations Delaware attracts annually. Given the strong inertia behind the initial corporate decision and the weak drivers for Dexit, it is unlikely to become widespread. Just because Elon Musk lost a lawsuit, took his ball away and went home, doesn't mean that other corporations are going to do. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been a great episode. I look forward to our next visit together. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Don.
Thank you, Tom.